Are you decrypting your SSL traffic in order to prevent data breaches? Well, the data says you probably are not doing this, so keep listening. Welcome to Threat Talks. My name is Lieuwe Koning, and here from the Security Operations Center floor at Ontoit, we bring you Threat Talks, the deep dive. And the subject of the day is the top 3 things to do in SSL decryption. Let's get on to it.
Welcome to Threat Talks. Let's delve deep into the dynamic world of cybersecurity.
Let me introduce our guest of the day. His name is Maas. He's a friend of the show, of course, and my dear colleague and field CTO of Ontoit. And Rob is really an advocate of SSL decryption. He always nags me, customers, everyone about how important it is and what you need to do and how easy it is in his mind to achieve SSL decryption throughout your organization. Well, there's many people who think differently, so let's find out what we can do and why we should do it and all those kind of things. Rob, welcome.
Thank you.
You told me that 95% of all web traffic these days is encrypted. So by that we mean SSL, HTTPS, right, instead of HTTP.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and all the malware that's out there, all the attacks that we see, how many attacks use SSL in some form to conceal themselves?
Yeah, so over 70% of the attacks use encryption to evade their attack, bypass common network security products.
Yeah, so 70%. So if you're not looking into that traffic, then you miss like 70% of all malware. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, you cannot see the attacks then, at least not from happening. There are a few other things you can check, but yeah, the traffic is on your network. So if you don't decrypt it, you don't see it. You cannot stop it.
Okay, and how much? What are they using it for? What kind of techniques do they?
Yeah, the main use case is downloading malware. So within that 70%, almost 90% is being used to drop the malware download to an end user or a server, or at least to get the malware to the endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And that's modern network firewalls, next-gen firewalls, layer 7 firewalls are really good at detecting those malware downloads. So you can already prevent them from getting into your network at an early stage if you do decryption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the early stage of the kill chain. Huh? So it's either... can I imagine if I get an email with a malicious link and I click on it, that's probably SSL, and therefore, if you don't look into it, then you have the malware on your machine, right? That's what you're.
What I often explain to customers is I will draw on kind of an onion, so all kinds of circles. And then in the middle there's the data, or at least the objective for the attacker, and then we can have all these layers around it of security. And in the middle, of course, you have your endpoint protection security. But on the outside, or mainly the most outside circle, that's your network security, because that is where the traffic comes into your network and where you can start putting in controls. And with decryption, you can, most of the malware attacks at least, you can stop there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as always, the first stages of the earlier you catch something is usually easier, more effective, cheaper, right?
You should try to stop attacks as early as possible, because then you also have a fallback. If you fail there, then you can rely on other layers.
So how many organizations, what fraction of organizations actually apply this SSL decryption to look into this?
Yeah, that's terribly low. It's only 3.5% of the organizations that have an active decryption policy. Yeah, next to nothing. Yeah.
So if you are part of those 3.5%, congratulations, you're doing a good job. And keep listening, because we actually, probably going to help you with expanding your coverage of SSL decryption. If you're part of the 96.5%, for sure keep listening, because now Rob is going to explain to us why it is so important.
Yeah. So we briefly touched upon it already. So visibility is the main thing. Just know what's happening in your network. The next thing then, if you have visibility, you can also start working on prevention. So if you see that malware is coming in, or you see malicious traffic or URLs being accessed, then you can stop them there. It's also the other way around. If people try to attack your service, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, for example, you can also stop them at an early stage, so you don't rely on the application.
Yeah, and if you have a lot of applications, I can imagine. So suppose you have a server farm with lots of apps there, and rather than individually having to make sure that on all those machines there's a SQL injection prevention, for example, you can also do it at one spot in the firewall.
Yeah, and it's also an extra layer. So first of all, the developer, of course, should have implemented proper mechanisms that SQL injection is not an issue, or should not be an issue. But you have your network, your firewall in front of it, which can also detect SQL injection attacks or cross-site scripting, etc. So again, here you have these layers, and you can, if you do decryption, you can stop these attacks on an early stage instead of relying on the developer having done a good job.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how does that encryption in the first place work?
Yeah, so
because it's difficult to do. That's why I'm asking. Because it's difficult on a technical level. I mean, it always boggles me if we're talking about decryption. I mean, we invented encryption to make sure that we cannot look into the traffic, and then now you're suddenly saying, "Hey, look into it." That sounds contradictory.
Yeah, it sounds. So I think we did maybe a too good job at protecting ourselves or encrypting the traffic, but also we're now bypassing our own security products. Like I said, the next gen firewalls cannot look into it, so it's becoming kind of a layer 4 basic firewall. So we succeeded a bit too good at doing encryption, and encryption in itself is quite easy nowadays. And I think it's the same for decryption, although a lot of components are involved. So you should understand how encryption works. So I think that's a nice bridge to start with. And then we can explain how decryption works. Because if you know how encryption works, then decryption should become easy for everyone as well.
I know it's an impossible question, but could you simply, in simple terms, explain how encryption works?
Yeah, so the most simple part is if you want to put a server on the network and you want to do encryption, so every user that goes to the server, the traffic you want to have encrypted, then you start with getting a certificate. You can generate one yourself, or you can go to Let's Encrypt. It's a very common one nowadays. And
because it's for free, and therefore it's also nice for attackers.
Yeah, that is also why the encryption, the number of encrypted traffic raised so much the last couple of years. And that certificate contains two things, at least two primary things. That's the public key and a private key. And we talk here about asymmetric encryption. And that means that if I encrypt something with that public key, I can only decrypt it with the private key. So you cannot decrypt it again with the public key. And how it works is if the client accesses the server will say, okay, I can set up a connection with you. Here's my public part.
Yeah, so let's say you are a client and I'm a server, and you want to connect with me, and you want to make sure that I am who I say I am.
Yeah, so I just start a connection with you, and then you say, okay, yeah, it's fine, you can connect with me. Here's my public certificate that contains the name, but also the certificate authority that verify that you are you, so that I know, okay, I'm really connecting to Lieuwe in this
signature.
case. Yeah, your signature and the date when it was done until when it is valid. But it also contains the public key. You will send that all to me, so only the public part of the certificate. And then I can validate. So I should also trust the certificate authority that said that you are you. So if I trust that certificate authority, then my browser.
It's a chain of trust where the signature, you can actually validate that if my public key says my name is Lieuwe, then you can actually you validate because you know those.
Yeah, I trust the certificate authority, and then I say, okay, I trust this. This is normally done by the web browser automatically in the background, so the user doesn't have to care about it. If it is not valid, so if the web browser decided, okay, I don't trust the certificate authority, or the certificate is not valid anymore, you will get this warning. You're visiting an untrusted website. Are you sure you want to go through? Most people will click still and go through, but the idea here is the idea here is think twice. Why is that happening? But let's say I trust the certificate. What then happens is a session key will be generated. That's being locally done on my machine. The web browser will take care of that, and that session key will be encrypted with the public key, and then I will send back that encrypted session key to you.
So you encrypt it with the public key. So I get a secret that you encrypted with my public key.
Yeah, and like we said before, if I encrypt something with the public key, it can only be decrypted with the private key, not with the public key again.
Which I have, so I know your secret now.
Exactly.
Okay.
And nobody else, even if they're sniffing on the line, they can get that encrypted packet, but they should not be able to decrypt it because the private key is really for you, and you should really take care of that it sticks with you. What then happens is you receive that session key. You will decrypt it with the private key. You have the session key, and now we have established a secure communication channel. And now I can say, okay, now I want to get the web page, or I want to download, or I can ask you what I want. And I will encrypt that request with the session key. which we both have. But you have it as well. So I send it. I encrypt my request with the session key. You receive it, and you said, "Okay, this is the session key," and then
we now
decrypt
have
it.
like a symmetric algorithm
symmetric
during the
algorithm,
transport phase. So yeah,
and there are some new ciphers that make it more difficult, but in essence, this is what's needed to do encryption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if I want to break that, so now someone, where is our attacker Luca? I mean, he's, so if he would be here in the middle, right? So what he needs to, does he need to have then? My private key.
Ideally, your private key. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
he's not getting it from me.
that's good. You should really take care of that private key. If you want to decrypt it, you have there are two ways of decrypting traffic. Either one is you have the private key. So if it is your own web server where you want to do decryption, that's quite easy because then the firewall in line should also have the private key.
Yeah, so let's see. So I'm in the server again, and I want to protect myself, but I want some other device. Let's say there's a next generation firewall in front of me, and I want this next generation firewall to be able to see the same traffic as me.
Yep.
That you're sending me and back and forth and everything. And you're saying, well, if you just learn, I'll just tell him my private key, my secret.
Yeah. So if we have the same flow, so I set up a new session with you. You have put the private key on that firewall and the certificate as well, so that the whole pair is there. Then I connect to you. Say I want to connect to you. You say, okay, that's fine. Here you have the public part of the certificate, so that's all the same. Then I will validate the certificate and generate a session key. Session key will be encrypted with the public key. I will send that to you, but now the firewall sees that I'm sending an encrypted packet to you, and it says, okay, but I have the private key for this server, so I can just read along. I can use my private key on the firewall to see what the session key is. It will store the session key. The packet will just go through further to you. You will also have the private key, and the server can also decrypt the packet and see the session key. So now, of course, I have the session key, the firewall has the session key, and you have the session key. So if I do now a request to you, and I encrypt that request with the session key, then all three of us can just read along. So this is really easy, low impact.
So this is a solution in all situations where you as an organization host some kind of web service or something SSL decrypted. You own the key, and therefore you can learn it to your security equipment and they can read along.
Yeah.
And then imagine that if they find malware, for example, because of old-fashioned AV signature-based stuff, but it could also be sandboxing and all that. I mean, at some point, this firewall is going to know, this is bad. They cannot re-encrypt the traffic, I guess, but they can send a reset or so. Stop the transfer.
Yes, or just drop
the packet.
Drop the package is more common, because if you do a TCP reset, then you will inform the attacker and say, okay, there's at least something in between that discovered me. And most attacks will not be malware. It can be if you have a file upload service, for example. But most of these attacks will be the web attacks, the OWASP attacks, and modern firewalls can simply detect those.
Okay, so what are difficulties here in this scenario where we are? Because we're talking about inbound encryption.
Yeah, there are a few things that can be challenging. First of all, is some vendors require you to have the certificate and private key on the box, and also update the certificate once the validity expires. I think it's a good thing. But you need to take into account that we getting used to short-lived certificates. 3 months is quite common nowadays already. So that means that you need to replace the certificate on the firewall every 3 months. The private key should stay the same. So that's only a one-time action normally. If you have a proper setup, you generate the key locally, you ask the certificate, you get the certificate, and then you store them on the web server.
I have at least 10 questions about this.
Okay.
First of all, your remark about, we're going towards smaller lived sessions. I mean, I remember the days where you would buy a 5-year SSL certificate for your website.
Yeah.
That's no longer, why? Why is that no longer common practice?
It's better to just validate more often if you are still you. So you get not impersonated by someone else, or if you leak your, you get hacked and somebody else tries to pretend you. So the shorter the session is, the more I'm sure that you're still you.
Recent validation is always better.
Yeah.
And I imagine you also don't have to have the hassle of the revocation list. That's always
that's also a thing. So if we go back to the process, if you send me your certificate, then I'm going to validate if it's still valid. I can also validate that with external sources. There are two common methods for that. That's the certificate revocation list. That's simply a web server hosting a kind of a text file where all the certificates
actually work properly. It's usually feel open because
in internal public key infrastructures that works quite okay. It's okay. But the second method is more dynamic. That's the Online Certificate Status Protocol, OCSP. That basically means that I'm going to check with the authority if that certificate is still valid or not.
Mm-hmm. So it's an extra layer because the whole attack here would be that, like we said, my private key is so secret. Mm-hmm. If I give it to my firewall, then my firewall knows, but nobody else should know, because as soon as they know, then they can sign any traffic on behalf of me, and that's what needs to be avoided. And shorter lifetimes of certificates help that, because if you lose it, you only lose it till the expiry date of the certificate.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. But and then you said the challenge of this is, since I learned my private key to my firewall, and if it say I change every week, do I then have to reconfigure my firewall every week? Is that what you're saying?
For some firewalls it is. Some vendors, as long as the private key don't change, don't care. And some vendors say I always need to have a valid public part of the certificate and the private key on my box. So then you need to replace the public part of the certificate.
Okay. So we cleared. I have the key, but the public key that I send out contains an encrypted version of the key, but also a signature that is time constrained, right? But the key itself, I don't have to change. So I can re-sign my certificate over and over again to revalidate it.
Yeah, correct.
And then only if I really lose the key, I have to...
Then you're in trouble. You should throw away everything and start over again.
And you're saying some firewalls don't care if the certificate changes as long as the underlying private key is the same?
Correct.
And other firewalls say, hey, I just need a chain every time.
Yeah.
And so every time you need to do some kind of automation to tell the firewall all the time, hey, listen, this is my new...
Most firewalls have good APIs for this, so you can automate it. It would be nice if they also do that within the UI, make some possibilities for that, makes it easier or more accessible for a lot of users. But it's not too hard to automate, but that might be a challenge.
Yeah, I know a person who actually wrote some software for common firewalls to do this, and he's standing right beside me. Yeah. So you know all about that. Yeah, and in practice, but then you might argue, okay, so if I rely on that piece of integration, because I have to hook into the certificate signing process. What if that fails? I mean, does my site go down then?
Yeah, that's the fail open or fail close discussion you often have with firewalls. What if things break? Should traffic still allowed to pass through or not? And that's a policy question.
Yeah. But you could configure it in such a way that if this part breaks, it sends out an alert to the SOC or whatever. Yeah. For, hey, listen, we have a mismatch in the key, so we can no longer decrypt.
Yeah, decryption fails, but still let the traffic pass through.
So that is an option. If availability is more important to you than this, then you could do that.
That's an option. Yeah.
You also mentioned something, and I think I heard you say about who generates this key. So, because I am still the web server, I want to make it, because you made it very clear that this private key is really private, right? Yeah. So you shouldn't send it to anyone. So who generates it? You said hopefully people generate it themselves. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So the ideal scenario is that you create a certificate signing request, as it's called, that will create a key and a signing request. The signing request does not contain the private key. That signing request you will send to, for example, Let's Encrypt, and they can sign that certificate then for you and give you back the certificate, but that's only the public part because the private part was already on your system. Mm-hmm. That's the way it should be done. However, since...
Yeah, so in order for my key to be signed, I do not need my key to be known to the signer. That's what you're saying?
Correct, yeah.
And that's possible?
That's possible.
With a CSR, a certificate signing request.
Correct.
But that's not practice. What is the other option?
Yeah, the other option, what you see a lot is people find this process complex. Is that they just go to a certificate authority and say, I need a certificate. and they will sign it for you, or they will create it for you with a private key, and they will send it somehow to you, mostly just over the line or with a download.
If an SSL encrypted website, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But that means already that your certificate authority has the private key. It needs to be sent to you, and then hopefully it will not be intercepted. But it's hard to prove.
Yeah. You never know, of course. And they probably have some kind of measure in place that they immediately drop it, or it's only in RAM or whatever. But if the Secret Service is very interested in a private key, then we'll probably have a copy of it.
So, but that that's still a scenario we see a lot, because people find the getting a certificate signing request quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of companies offer the service. Hey, I can create a certificate for you, and I will send a certificate.
If I'm an average nerd, is it hard for me to learn this?
No, I think even if you use AI to ask, how do I create a certificate signing request, you have a response within a few seconds, and then...
Shall we do this and put it in the show notes?
Yeah, we can. No problem.
How to request a certificate without exposing your private key in the first place?
Yeah, something
let's
definitely do.
Okay, I think that's most of my questions about what you said about... I forgot what you were telling, actually.
We were doing inbound decryption. We come, still to the hard part.
For the outbound encryption.
Outbound encryption.
Yeah, so indeed, let's summarize inbound encryption. There's a couple of steps involved, and we covered a lot of it, but the gist of it is, hey, I already have my private key in my web server. The only thing I need to do is make sure that private key is in my next-gen firewall and set a decryption policy. That's it. Yeah, and then the extra stuff is like, what if the key changes and all that? Yeah. But if you can even start with that just by just doing it, and then
you can if you're still
open if it doesn't work.
Yeah, if you're still worried if you're doing things right, you can say, okay, but I only have the decryption policy for a certain source IP address or a source user. So then you can simply test it out if it works, and then go make it more wide for the whole public.
Yeah, you can put your home IP in, or your
and you can simply test it. So it's also something you can do in very small steps to make sure that things work.
And once I've done this, so now I am this web server, I have this next-gen firewall in front of me, I taught it my private key, and now it is able to see my traffic. What do I benefit from? What will this firewall stop for me?
So that you get visibility, everything that's going to your web server, and if the firewall then sees kind of attacks, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, web attacks,
typical IPS events, intrusion prevention.
Yeah, most of the time. But if you have a file upload service, it might also see some malware being uploaded to you, and then you can stop these attacks already at your network layer, so they don't even get to your server.
Okay, good. And you spoiled a little bit. This was the easy part, right? Well, I still follow along, and I think
this one is
some practice. Maybe
this is really
this is doable.
Yeah, this is should do or must do in my opinion.
And this applies to servers, right? So I mean, a typical web client or laptop, or that they don't have inbound traffic.
Correct.
It's just for the stuff that you expose to the internet or to your internal users. That's where you need to do this.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
But now the other way, outbound. So, and I think this is going to fail. Because if I want to go the other way around, so now I am the client and you are the server, let's say Gmail, and I want to go to you, and then and I want have my protection layer here, so that if I go to Gmail, I don't download malware, right? That's the point.
Yeah, that's
right?
the point.
Outbound traffic. Yeah. And you just told me that the server's private key needs to be in the firewall.
Yeah. And Gmail is not going to give that to you.
I did call Google, and they won't.
No, that's so the mechanism is...
This is what it's made for, right? It's not... You're not...
Correct.
My firewall is not supposed to look into my private stuff because I'm going to SSL, so it's
I think when we invented it was not mainly about firewalls looking into stuff, but people. But the mechanism is exactly the same. So Gmail has a private key and a public part of the certificate, and they're never going to give you the private key because then you can impersonate them. So what we need to do is break open the traffic, and it's sometimes referred to as a man in the middle. Attack or mechanisms depend on which hat you wear.
Trying to avoid in every other situation. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what will happen is, and you need a few things in place, and that makes it maybe a bit more complex. I don't think it's really difficult necessarily, but you have a few components involved. Mm-hmm. And the first one is you need to have your own certificate authority at your organization. We call that a public key infrastructure. And that certificate authority is responsible for all the certificates that you use within the organization. And that should generate an intermediate or subordinate certificate. And that's a special certificate that's allowed to sign new certificates in order of that certificate authority.
Okay.
So that's the first part. That's what we need to prepare. We say to the firewall that's in between that it gets a subordinate certificate that's trusted by your local certificate authority. We put that on the firewall, and now the firewall is able to generate certificates on its own. And we'll come to that when that happens. So if you go back to the
Yeah, wait a second, because you're going quickly, of course, and I'm not sure everybody followed.
Okay.
So what you're saying is there's a different kind of certificate. Because so far we've been talking about certificates that sign a web server.
Mhm.
Its purpose of this certificate, actually, if I noticed correctly, in the certificate, it says the purpose of the certificate is to sign, to prove the authenticity of a server, right?
Yeah.
And now you're talking about a different kind of certificate that is, its purpose is to sign other certificates.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is the organization should have. But they will be their own. Let's encrypt then. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's
Like the top level
exactly
authority.
what I'm saying for all their local certificates. So they most organizations nowadays have a lot of services, run also encrypted.
Yeah, many organizations have this. The 3.5% that you're talking about, that's certainly not true for PKI infrastructure.
Mhm.
That's more like
that should be way higher.
Yeah. No, but if you have Active Directory, you have it by default, for example. It
you
depends
don't have
whether
it by default. You need to enable it and install it. And
just a click box and next finish.
There are some processes that you should include, but that's I think we should do that in a whole different episode.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, let's see if we have a thing called key bearers, the people who actually carry around physical stuff, because the root certificate for Onto It, for example, we actually guard offline.
It should be offline, and that's for every organization should be the same.
Yeah, we will make a deep dive then on how to set up a PKI infrastructure the proper way, because you can also do a lot of.
Yeah, if you simply enable it in Active Directory, or
that's not the proper way.
Then it's not the proper way.
No. Okay, but what you're saying is there needs to be some kind of system that's able to sign certificates that are then trusted by everyone in the organization.
Yeah, within the organization. That's exactly right. So you have your local certificate authority, and every client that's within your organization, every endpoint should trust your local certificate authority.
So how do you do this? Because you mentioned before that if my client is going to my web server, they trust Let's Encrypt somehow that the CA is in their browser.
Yeah, so
the browser knows that if Let's Encrypt signed it, that's okay. But now, we can't get a browser. Download a browser that includes the Onto It CA, for example.
That's exactly also one of the challenges you will get if you do outbound decryption. So that's should be quite easy for your internal clients, and especially if they are managed, because then you can put the public part of the certificate authority in the trusted list of the clients by a group policy, for example.
Yeah. So what then happens is that the browser, instead of Let's Encrypt, VeriSign, all of the trusted signage, you add something to it, you add yourself to it.
Yeah, correct.
But this is quite common in most organizations, I'd say, right? Many organizations do this already.
You should have, probably a lot of applications will already break if you don't have this in place.
Yeah, because also if you want to have your internal applications signed, you typically don't go to a public site. If it's an internal host name, you'd better not do this publicly, right? Because those logs are there.
Yeah, you should really consider, if you don't have a public key infrastructure already for that, you should really consider it, because the other part, what some people might do is generate a self-signed certificate. Most applications support that. So they will generate a certificate with the private key on the fly, but then you need to extract that public certificate that's self-signed and put it on all the clients that are contacting that server. And
so you need to trust each and every site individually instead of everything that your organization signed on behalf of.
Correct.
So it's not, you need a PKI infrastructure not just for outbound SSL decryption.
No, you should already have it.
Have it.
And otherwise consider to install it.
Yeah. So in a couple of weeks, we'll see when we'll find our key bearer. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So that's a prerequisite. You create this subordinate certificate that can sign on behalf of your certificate authority. You put that on the firewall, and what happens then if you connect to me? If I'm Gmail, you connect to me, but the firewall will stop your session. So it stops already at the firewall because you're going to Gmail, and it has a Gmail decryption policy in place. And then what it will do is the firewall will set up a session with me. So the firewall becomes the endpoint. So for me, it's the same. I see just a session coming in. I will send my public certificate to the firewall. The firewall will then check if that's a valid certificate. So the firewall will check with his trusted list of certificate authorities.
So my firewall as an organization becomes the browser of the user.
more or less.
To you, Google.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Okay.
And then it will check the validity of the certificate. If it is valid, it will generate a session key just as before, and it will encrypt the session key with a public key and send it back to me.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have a secure session with the firewall.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing the firewall will do is it will generate a certificate on the fly with the subordinate that it just created, and it will put in as much of the details as possible from the original certificate. So the same name, the validity dates, etc. It will all be in that certificate, and it will be signed by your subordinate certificate. So it will be trusted by with your certificate authority, and that will be sent to you. So you will get a public certificate that's just recently created, but it looks like it came from Gmail. But if you look really closely to it, you see that it is issued by your local certificate authority.
Yeah. So it still get the green stuff in the proper certificate, but not because Google signed it, but because the firewall signed it. And since I trust thanks to the PKI infrastructure, the public certificate, it's now okay. But I can still see indeed that the firewall is my web server now. So firewall acts as if the firewall acts as if it is Gmail, and to you, Gmail, the firewall acts as the client. In the middle.
Yeah, and you
That's
get you receive this public certificate. So you do this validity check. You say, okay, it's valid. I will generate the session key. So the same encrypted session key with a public key. Send it to the firewall. The firewall has just generated the public and private key. So it can decrypt the session key. So it could be a completely different session key as I have with the firewall.
Probably is.
The chances are really, really low. And then you also have a secure session. So you have a secure session with the firewall, and I as Gmail also have a secure session with the firewall. Then you say, okay, I want to download this file, or I want to I want to get all my mails. That's your request. You encrypt that with the session key, send it to the firewall. Firewall decrypts it. It's a man in the middle, so it can easily check everything if it is in order. And then it needs to re-encrypt your request with the session key the firewall has with Gmail and send it to Gmail. And then I have the session key that I had with the firewall, decrypt it, and I know what to send back, and then it goes back and forth.
What about performance?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it used to be a problem. This used to be really a challenge, let's say 10, 15 years ago, because the hardware was too slow to do this.
Prehistoric.
So especially if you look at hardware firewalls, most hardware firewalls nowadays have specific hardware to create, so that the most of the compute is in generating a public and private key, this asymmetric key pair.
Yeah, that has to do for every request that we do.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of loads.
At least at the start of your browsing session. It's not like for every request, but for every time a user gets to Gmail.
Yeah,
in our
correct. And so that generation on a traditional CPU is relatively slow. And that's why we used to have performance bottlenecks there if we turn this on. Nowadays, hardware firewalls come quite often with specific hardware that are optimized to generate these key pairs. So performance, especially on hardware firewalls, performance is not really an issue anymore. I don't see it almost never. But in the cloud, you have a challenge here because we run VM firewalls in the cloud, and they only have traditional CPUs. And traditional CPUs are not really good at key generation, like we said. Although most of them will be fast enough for your company, especially if you do things in the cloud, is mostly inbound, so you don't have to do this whole process.
Yeah, but SASE maybe?
Yeah, for SASE, for example, but SASE will scale automatically, so it's not your concern. Yeah, in most cases,
just makes it more expensive to the vendor.
Yeah, but you probably have a license with your vendor, and they will scale out if needed. So your performance is not often an issue unless you host firewalls yourself in the cloud. Then you might need to check, hey, if I allow 100 users, how is my performance doing? And I scale up to 200, 300, etc. Keep an eye on it. But performance is nowadays not often a bottleneck anymore. No.
So if we do this, yes, there needs to be PKI infrastructure. Yes, we need to be careful that we don't enable it all at once. So we monitor the CPU usage. It also opens, but then and then the firewall can do the same thing as we just discussed with inbound, right? You mentioned that. So the IPS, the AV, and all the features that are in there are actually into play. So that 70% of malware, we can actually detect much better everything that we download.
Correct. Yeah.
This sounds like much more important to me actually than the inbound stuff. Would you agree to that?
I agree. Well, I think both are really important. Outbound is because a lot of attackers try to get a foothold with an endpoint in your organization, and that means that
usually the first point of entry.
Yeah, correct. So
if you fix that,
so they need to send some malware or at least some software to your system. So that's why it's really important. But on the other hand, if you look at inbound, it's so easy to do. Why not just take that extra layer of security?
Yeah. So you should do outbound because it's really important, and inbound because it's so easy, and it should be punished for not doing it. That's
more or less. Yeah.
Since in my outbound scenario, the firewall is the client.
Mm-hmm.
It also means, I think, that you can control that policy then. Huh? For example, you mentioned, hey, you can click on the next button, so ignore the SSL faulty SSL certificate.
Mm-hmm.
The firewall now has to do that. So I can imagine your policy could be never do that.
Correct. You can say never go to a website with a expired certificate, for example. It's just not allowed by company.
Yeah. And now you have to try to have all the browsers. If you don't have SSL decryption in this situation, you have to go to all the browsers that people may use and make sure that there is some kind of policy enforced that they cannot press that button.
No, I'm not sure.
Which is impossible.
I don't even think all browsers have such policy. It's more or less let it up to the user to decide. So then you go back for user awareness.
So that's an additional thing that's really helpful.
Yeah, but I think we're now discussing certificates already because it's a difficult, at least seen as a difficult topic. We cannot go to regular users, say, okay, but if you get this warning, you should take a look at the certificate and check all the fields. If you still will trust it, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's a fallacy. That is a good idea to train users on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
We can technically control this, so why would we allow a user in the first place to do
exactly.
That? Yeah. Okay. So what's the difficulty here? PKI infrastructure, you have to fix it anyway.
Maybe some. So we have a few other concerns, I would say, that I often hear. So complexity, we already discussed. A lot of components, but not necessarily really difficult, in my opinion. But regulations, and especially around privacy, is often heard. Argument to say I'm not going to decrypt. In most cases, and you should check with the vendor and the solution, it is the case that they decrypted the traffic, but as an end user, so as an administrator, you cannot simply see the traffic itself. So I cannot, if I decrypt the email, I cannot simply read your email. So they already created policies in place within the system that as an administrator, I cannot simply read your email. So that's one thing to check.
Honestly, I don't never really understand this, because I mean that also means then I think if you have that train of thought, listen, don't decrypt because then you can see stuff potentially. Yes, you can, but then you should also not have an antivirus or an endpoint protection on your endpoint, because the endpoint decrypts it, puts it on the disk. We can also see everything.
And you have the same discussion, but people easily step over it if you do anti-malware or anti-spam. So if you scan your email for spam, you basically do the same, because then the spam filter is often your endpoint, the first endpoint where the email is stored, and there it's being decrypted. But otherwise, I cannot check if it is spam. So you probably already have a policy in place that says, okay, if you work for this company, our systems are able to check all the content that you get or whatever is praised. So that should not be a concern.
Yeah, depending on the jurisdiction. But what you're saying is, hey, you better openly communicate about to everyone. Hey, this is the kind of things we do.
Yeah.
So if you want to do your private stuff and you're really concerned about this, don't do it in your company's equipment. Do it at home.
Yeah, and then you only have the laws maybe that can prevent it. But in Europe, for most countries, and also in the US, you're allowed pretty much to see everything to protect yourself. That's then the justification to say, okay,
I'm not doing all. I mean, if you really go to the max on this privacy thing here, then there will be no security.
Yeah, That's
so that it can't be like that.
Yeah.
And,
So as a company, you're allowed to protect yourself, and therefore you are allowed to decrypt the traffic.
And then abuse of this may be real, but there's different controls you need to implement to prevent that. Huh? So, for example, indeed, choose a product that doesn't save all the files that it sees in the traffic. For example, in a cache disk or whatever. That shouldn't be the case.
Exactly.
Those kind of things, and of course, 4I's principle for admins and all that stuff. There's many things you can do there, but that do work.
Yeah, correct. One other thing that might people scared away from doing decryption is key pinning. So key pinning means that you already know what the official certificate looks like. So kind of a hash that you created of the original certificate. If I then sit in the middle as a firewall and I generate a new certificate, although it looks valid, it doesn't match the checksum you have.
So I know the signature of the key. So then you're not in this example, you're not Google, but you are mybank.com, and I know something of the key that you're using to encrypt it. So like a fingerprint, and I can validate that as well. So I validate the signature, but also the key.
And that's called HTTPS public key pinning, HTTPK, and it used to be a very it used to be standardized in Google and Firefox. But since a lot of companies started complaining about, hey, we cannot do the decryption anymore, they already made some ways to circumvent the key pinning. They stopped with it in 2018. So it's already a few years ago, but still some people refer to it, hey, but if they do key pinning, which everyone is doing nowadays, which is not valid anymore, but that used to be a big problem.
But that's for browsers.
That's mainly for
the browser.
Browser
is the judge here that says, hey, this is encrypted or not.
Yeah.
And that doesn't use those technologies anymore. But then why is it still an issue?
So it's more or less an issue because it was an issue, and still people didn't see that Google and Chrome dropped support for key pinning. So it's not part of the web browser anymore. What still can happen, and that also brings us to one of the best practices, don't do this as a big bang, outbound decryption, because you might have some other applications, so maybe not browsers, that do this. So if I do this at larger companies, I typically found 1 or 2 applications that have a kind of certificate pinning that cannot be decrypted.
An app, like a app on your phone.
GitHub clients are very common for this. So, and then you need to think, what do I want to do with it? What's my policy? You can just make an exception, saying, okay, but for this client, it's just allowed to go decrypted through. Or maybe you just want that the client no longer be in use. That's just a company policy. But don't go do it in a big bang.
What about client certificates?
Yeah, so client certificates are pretty hard, especially if it comes to mutual TLS. So you have the client and the server doing it.
Yeah, so what I mean indeed is you are the server, I'm the client. The whole thing we've talked about so far is that I, as a client, validate that you are legit. But now, and then by username, password, OTP, I prove to you that I'm who I say I am, right? But I can also use a client certificate, and then it gets decrypted.
Yeah, so
let's not go into that because we're on the clock here.
Okay.
But how it actually works. But
the simple answer here is you cannot decrypt it. There are some gray areas where you can do something, but I would say don't go there. Just
okay. But that brings me to the question: what should we decrypt? Should we decrypt everything outbound? Or is that like could we partially do it, like the stuff that is risky, or can we do like
for inbound? And so for inbound, I always should aim for 100%, and then go down from what you don't want to. If you want to do it the other way around, then at least go for URL categories that are already suspicious. So malware categories, newly registered domains is a really good one, and start there. That's so.
Yeah, and maybe the stuff that we don't know about.
Yeah, exactly. Unknown categories.
Yeah, but that's. I mean, there's always the examples of the news site that got hacked and got.
Yeah, so I would always start with we aim for 100%, and then we are going to make exceptions where we're not going to do it.
Okay, so let's see. Let's try to wrap up a little bit. So maybe we have some. We said we have 3 types of advice, at least top 3 of things to do, and let's start with the users that are new to this. So what's the first thing you would say to that?
Yeah, start small. Start with 1 server if you do inbound, or maybe 1 user if you do outbound. Just test it and grow from there. But don't try to do it all at once. By starting small, you get confidence. You know all the components involved, and you can get confidence to grow bigger.
Would you rather have if we're talking about inbound, I get that. I mean, you can do it on a per server basis. That's you either do it or not for that server, right? Outbound, there's multiple choices. We can indeed say one user or for the IT team or whatever, and expand it a little bit. That's one angle in which you can.
That's the angle I normally use.
Okay, and I'm interested in why this one, because the other one would be I'll first do the unknown URLs, and then I'll do the malware as well, or the bad ones, and then the unknowns, and then the news sites, and then and go by that. So broaden the scope for maybe a large group of users. Why would you choose?
Both are good, I think. However, including news sites is more difficult, and the new categories will be also added sometimes when they say, okay, this might be a good new category for us. And then it's not sure if it is in the encryption policy or decryption policy or not. If you go the other way around, the benefit that I see is that if you start with some users, mainly IT users, they understand more of what's going on and why you're doing this. And also, if things don't work, they more have a tendency to tell you, okay, I cannot access this site. Can we?
Yeah, and they give you a proper answer on what actually fails.
Exactly.
Right? Not like computer doesn't work.
So what I normally do is I start with IT users and then go to the whole IT organization and then expand from there, mostly per group of users, till we really are confident that we have found all the applications and exceptions.
And you start with your optimal decryption policy, which decrypts everything that we can decrypt.
Yeah, and if I then go, for example, to the developers who often have some third-party tools, then I expand there, and I found one application that that doesn't work with it. Then I can make an exception for that application. If I do, that's maybe the second point already. Don't do this in a big bang, because especially
so first is start small. Second is don't do a big bang.
Yeah, because if you do this as a big bang and you have sites that are not working, then people are all going to blame it as the decryption policy. It never works, and you probably have to revert back, especially if it contains if an important person is affected by it. So if you do it per step, per group, for example, you can easily make exceptions for the things that you will find.
Okay, and the third one, I would like to know, what do I start first? Outbound, inbound? How do I decide on that? Which part?
My opinion is start with inbound, because it gives you a hang of the process. How does it work? The public, private key, all the components involved, and you're really protecting then already your servers. And then go to outbound. But it depends also a bit on your preference, and if you even have public service available, maybe you're just a production line and only have some users going to the internet. And outbound, of course, is the.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's a lot to unwrap today. I hope we made it much clearer how encryption and decryption works. We have some homework for a next episode. We're going to talk about setting up a PKI infrastructure, since it's that crucial to have, and there's things to do that wrong, and we didn't talk about that part, but you and I know there's a lot to tell about that. So some future, we still have to plan. So it's not going to be next week, but probably a few weeks later. All right. Rob, thank you very much for all of this. And viewers, well, you stick with us for 45 minutes at least. So thank you very much for that. If you like this, please express that to us by liking this video or this podcast. It helps us spread the word further, and we'd appreciate that. And if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you, or otherwise feedback. Send it to team@threat-talks.com. And from the Security Operations Center floor here at OnToIT, thank you very much and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Threat Talks, a podcast by OnToIT Cybersecurity and AMS-IX. Did you like what you heard? Do you want to learn more? Follow Threat Talks to stay up to date on the topic of cybersecurity.